Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my February wrap-up. Despite being the shortest month of the year and also my first full month of doing full-time work, I was somehow able to read, I think, 9 books, which is pretty good. Even if that number means nothing to you, I'm impressed by myself. February, of course, is Black History Month here in the United States. With only 1 or 2 exceptions, everything I read this month was written by a Black author. I know I don't have to do that, especially because personally I read from marginalized authors all year long, but it's a net positive. It never hurts to read more books by Black authors. And before I forget, in case you missed it, I had the tremendous opportunity to be part of a book club discussion for You Dreamed of Empires on NPR, of all places, as part of their 1A series. If you didn't catch it live, it should be up on their website by the time you see this, hopefully with a corresponding transcript coming soon, so I will link that down below in case you're interested. I gotta get started because we have a lot to get through, so let's just jump right in. The first book I read in February was my Arc of Saint Sorrow Sinner by Friedrich Moon, which is the third and final book in the Gideon Testaments, and it will actually have been recently released by the time you see this. I've said this before, but even though every installment in this novella series is a self-contained story, you should read them in publication order because later books in the series will spoil things from the previous ones. In the spirit of that, I'm going to try to give you a very general synopsis. This is a sapphic horror romance between a queer woman and a trans Latina woman. It's about a character named Sophia who was the victim of a religious cult in more ways than one, and now she possesses a very dangerous magical relic. She falls in with all the previous characters in this series who take her to seek help from a mysterious mystic to basically see if her soul can be saved. Content warnings for some body horror, animal death, depictions of mania and panic, discussions of sexual abuse, familial abuse, and religious abuse, some instances of blood and gore, drowning, some allusions to suicide ideation, and some sexual content. Also, the main character is queer and autistic, and as I said, her love interest Juniper is trans. This was so much fun to read and such a satisfying conclusion to what has been an incredibly memorable and exciting trilogy of horror romance novellas. It has all those elements of religious eroticism and mysticism that I've loved from the previous books, but also this really endearing element of found family now that the gang's all collected together in one place and bound by a single purpose. All the pieces and all the characters have their role to play in this final story, and I loved seeing how it all comes together. Thematically, this was an incredibly resonant finale as well, especially by centering a character like Sophia, who's ultimately on a journey of not just reclaiming her agency, but learning how to wield it for herself. This is someone who's been hurt in a number of ways, not just by the church, but also by people who she trusted. She's had a lot of things done to her without her permission or full understanding, and she's living with this dark magic trapped inside of her that also dictates her life and makes itself known without warning whenever it wants. So again, it's not just about her regaining a sense of agency and getting to a place where she can choose her own path in life, but it's also about how she's learning to reframe her entire definition of power itself. Up until this point, she's understood power as something to wield over someone else. Power means the capacity to hurt other people, the ability to control everyone and everything by any means possible. But there's also power in surviving, in finding a path forward for yourself, and also in resistance. Again, I just loved how all of these threads and storylines came together in this final installment. I had a great time reading it. I can't wait to see what Freydis does next, because I will, of course, be first in line to read it. Definitely recommend the trilogy overall, and I gave this 4.5 stars. After that, coincidentally, I picked up another arc of an indie romance, and that was When Stars Have Teeth by Danny Trujillo, which came out on February 13th. This is an indigenous and Latina romance written by an author of Pueblo and Mexican descent. We're following Buffy, who basically runs the San Francisco Urban Center, so she spends a lot of time and energy doing community work, trying to find funding, applying for grants, attending board meetings, and all that kind of stuff. So obviously, she has no leftover time or energy for pursuing romance. That is, until an ultra suave immigration lawyer named Santiago walks into her center and into her life. Just as a note, I believe Buffy is Cree and also bisexual, and Santiago is Pueblo and Mexican. Content warnings for some use of ableist language, explicit sexual content, brief mentions of vomit, some explorations of familial death and grief, and explorations of depression, depressive episodes, and suicidal thoughts. This book took me on a little bit of a roller coaster ride, I'm not gonna lie. It took me a second to warm up to it purely because the relationship starts off as a lust at first sight kind of dynamic, which is very much not my jam as a deeply fully demisexual, demi-romantic person. That's just not how my brain works. But then I was on board and I was vibing with it, and then it kind of lost me again at the end because I think it could have ended 1 or 2 chapters sooner than it did. But overall, I still like this and definitely want to read more of this author's work. If you've never read from Denny Trujillo before, I think an apt comparison for her work would be to say if you enjoy Adriana Herrera, which I do, then you'll most likely also enjoy her books. As I was reading this, it really called to mind American Love Story, which is also about an activist and a lawyer falling in love. And I do think When Stars Have Teeth does a great job of balancing discussions about social justice and also making space for romance and mental health in a similar way that American Love Story does. And I think romances like this are so worthwhile because it touches on how marginalized people, specifically in this case Indigenous people, are almost forced to be activists purely based on the fact of their existence in a world that actively pushes them into the margins, which can be channeled into something empowering, but it can also feel draining and isolating. Buffy feels obligated to give all her time, her energy, and her attention to her community because if she doesn't actively fight for them, no one else will. So she's constantly taking on more and more things, sacrificing her personal life and her personal time because she always feels like everything is on the line, and in some ways, it is. So there's an irony there because she spends so much time enriching and cultivating this beautiful community space, but she herself does not reap the benefits of that community, if that makes sense. Through this romance, she's learning that she doesn't have to take on everything alone. She can lean on other people. She can want things for herself without negating the things she wants for her community, which I think is a really powerful message. It's hard because I do think the romance between Santiago and Buffy is ultimately a really beautiful thing. It's tender, it's vulnerable, it's intimate. But like I said, it took me a second to get on board with Santiago, not only because it was purely physical at first, but because in the beginning, Buffy tells him over and over again that she does not want a relationship, but he is very persistent. And while he was ultimately right about them ending up together and being good for each other, at first it almost felt like he was undermining her agency at times. So it was a bit iffy to begin with for me personally, and like I said, I did not need the last 1 or 2 chapters to have been satisfied by the story overall, so I think after balancing everything out, this would be a solid 3.5 stars. Then I finally got a chance to listen to Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. The audiobook is read by the incomparable Adam Lazar White. This is a mixture of mystery and gritty crime thriller. It's about 2 fathers, both ex-cons, one is black, one is white, and their sons were married to each other and also brutally murdered in what appears to be a double homicide. So the loss of their sons is of course incredibly tragic, but then they learn that maybe this wasn't a random hate crime like they thought, but rather a targeted murder of their sons. The police claim they have no leads and no proof of this being a murder case, so these 2 fathers who have nothing in common besides their children and their criminal past band together to not only find out the truth about what happened to their children, but also to exact brutal and unforgiving revenge. Content warnings for expressions of homophobia and transphobia, including the use of homophobic and transphobic slurs, some use of racist and sexual slurs as well, mentions of vomit, descriptions of blood, death, and graphic injury and graphic violence, brief instance of misgendering, and some graphic references to past child abuse. It's kind of hard to explain my feelings about this story as a queer person because all at once I'm deeply appreciative of S.A. Cosby for writing a story like this and creating a fictional narrative, a fictional space through which to deconstruct homophobic rhetoric. But I also have to acknowledge that this was not written for me. The conclusions the story comes to are ultimately incredibly supportive of the queer community as a whole, so it is about queerness and it was created in solidarity with the queer community, but straight people who have yet to deconstruct their internalized homophobia are absolutely the intended audience. If you are queer, you're not going to come away from this story having learned anything you didn't already know, besides being potentially entertained by a wildly dynamic and intense crime thriller. It's very Queer 101 in some ways, but I also don't think that's an inherently bad thing because the intended audience could definitely benefit from a 101 debrief. If you're a queer person picking up this book, just know that it ultimately has an empowering message of radical acceptance and support, but you will have to be in the minds of characters who are actively confronting their own deeply held homophobia in order to get there in the end. I do not know S.A. Cosby's stake in writing a story like this, and that's none of my business. I do not care. What I do care about is that he's carried it out very thoughtfully and with a surprising amount of nuance. He's able to explore how homophobia is perpetuated within Black communities specifically, again, not something for me to personally speak to, but something I am aware of, and to also shine a light on how men often default towards hypermasculinity as a substitute for expressing pain or love. I think that's incredibly clear in this story because both Ike and Buddy Lee were not able to accept, much less love, their sons in life. But now that they're dead, they're funneling that grief, that love that has nowhere to go, into extreme violence. And they think that violence will serve as a sort of penance. And that violence, that performance of hypermasculinity, is a really interesting counterpoint to their son's queerness, especially because queer men are often emasculated by society or viewed as being emasculated in so many ways. So there's a lot of layers to the story. It's doing a lot of work, all while being an intense and suspenseful mystery thriller at the same time. I don't read a ton of thrillers, but S.A. Cosby is very clearly a master of his craft. He understands the genre on an intrinsic level and will always execute. His thrillers are exciting, they're dark, action-packed, gritty, and deeply cathartic. I will say there is a scene where a trans side character is outed, which I didn't think was necessary for a lot of reasons, and it was very clear to me that S.A. Cosby's understanding of transness is much more rudimentary in comparison to the rest of the story, so I would have been cool without that piece. So again, I'm very aware that this book was not written for me in many ways. Do I think it's the best example of what it's trying to do? No, I don't. Do I respect, understand, and appreciate its project? Yes, I do. S.A. Cosby is quickly turning into an auto-read author for me, and I do intend to read his other books. I think I would give this one 4 stars. Completely flipping the script, after that I picked up The Partner Plot by Christina Forrest. This came out on February 27th, but I read from an early finished copy that was gifted to me by Berkeley Romance. At its core, this story is a mixture of fake dating / marriage of convenience meets second chance romance. It's about 2 former high school sweethearts, Violet and Xavier, who were hopelessly in love as teenagers, fully convinced they would get married and stay together forever, but they did end up breaking things off as they began to move towards their respective careers. Violet became this very high-profile celebrity stylist, while Xavier had his own big dreams of becoming a professional basketball player. But when he was injured in college, he had to leave the sport behind, and to his own surprise, he moved back to their hometown and started teaching high school English. By chance, their paths cross in Vegas, where they reconnect and have one reckless night together. And when they wake up the next day with rings on their fingers, after they finish panicking, they realize that maybe staging a marriage could stand to benefit them in their respective careers. Content warnings for references to past experiences of partner infidelity, some descriptions of food poisoning and vomit, and some explicit sexual content. I'm actually going to keep this one brief because I shared a vlog a couple of weeks ago where I did finish this book and share at least my initial thoughts, so I will link that down below in case you missed it. I'm definitely a fan of the second chance romance. I love a good fake dating scenario, so I was always going to read this book. I will say that while this wasn't a standout romance for me, I still had a really good time reading this. What I appreciate most about this book is definitely the thematic work and the narrative parallels between the 2 main characters and the respective journeys they're on. I like that they both have a personal journey to undertake, but those individual storylines also feed back into the romance. Both characters really struggle with their own self-perception. It's really hard for them to take a step back and look at how far they've come in life, take stock of everything they've accomplished. Sometimes they can't even recognize their own success as success. So I really do like what the story has to say about giving ourselves grace, learning how to give ourselves credit and be proud of what we accomplish, no matter the scale of those accomplishments, and to just fight against the urge to diminish ourselves. Xavier also has an interesting storyline because his Achilles heel is the fact that he has this insatiable ambition. He feels like he didn't get the things in life that he wanted. He feels like he hasn't reached his full potential, which is all valid. But that ambition also doesn't allow him to appreciate what he already has. So it was interesting to see these characters navigate those career-based problems, figure out how to communicate about them, and process them together, which I think are all very worthwhile conversations. All that said, I thought this romance was just okay for two main reasons. First, there's a lot of setup in the story. It takes a really long time to even get to the hook of the story with this fake marriage facade, and the setup of that scenario is just far more complicated and far more time consuming than it actually needs to be. Secondly, even though I feel like we really do get to know the characters and also have ample pathways into becoming invested in their love story, when they actually got together, it just didn't do anything for me emotionally. I just felt like they were going through the motions, ticking off the usual romance boxes. So again, this was still pretty good. It laid the groundwork for a lot of worthwhile thematic discussions. It was a fun, lighthearted second chance romance that puts a refreshing spin on the marriage of convenience trope. It's not a new favorite for me personally, but I would still give it a solid 3 stars. After that, I listened to Remember Us by Jacqueline Woodson. I got the audiobook from my library and it's read by Jacqueline herself. This is a short middle grade coming of age story set in a Bushwick neighborhood referred to as the Matchbox, especially during this specific summer when so many of these older houses are catching on fire and burning to the ground. Our main character is a basketball player named Sage, who's not only dealing with the changing landscape of her neighborhood and the near constant fear that her building might be next, but also as her life is starting to split between the boys on the court and the girls at school, she's also just trying to figure out where she fits in and who she is. Content warnings for descriptions of fire, home loss, and fire-related trauma, some explorations of parental loss and grief, brief instances of bullying, and references to both child death and animal death. This book was such a pleasant surprise. I hadn't heard much about it beforehand. It's super short. I didn't know what to expect, especially considering the subject matter, but it's honestly kind of genius, and Woodson is able to pack an absolute punch in such a short amount of space. The summer of fires in this Bushwick neighborhood is the perfect backdrop for this coming-of-age story, because the destruction of so many homes really calls to mind the concept of impermanence. How nothing, no matter how stable or how constant we think it is, can last forever. But while some things are allowed the space to change gradually over time, what happens when that change doesn't come naturally or by choice? And as the families in this neighborhood are having to contend with this constant grief, this constant sense of loss, they're also faced with the question of how they continue on, especially when this destruction is inherently senseless. The main character, Sage, is also struggling to understand where she fits in, if she fits in, especially as someone who's a quote-unquote tomboy and kind of lives between those two disparate spaces. The people around her cause her to question and doubt herself, and as she's struggling with that, that also ties back into the destruction caused by these fires, because she's grappling with the temptation to self-immolate in some ways. This urge to change herself and destroy her past in favor of becoming someone who's easier for other kids to understand or to like. Ultimately, I think the story is really about learning how to hold on to the things that matter, the things that are truest about ourselves, the things that can't be taken away, and learning how to protect and cherish those things no matter what. It's not enough just to understand the most important and essential parts of ourselves, but we have to constantly remember them, even and especially when the world doesn't give us that space. So I really love this. Yes, it's difficult to read at times, but the hardship is very much balanced out by joy and tender thoughtfulness. It's incredibly empowering and insightful in what it's trying to do, and I would absolutely, without hesitation, recommend it. This was, without question, 5 stars. Then we have another dramatic shift in genres, because after that I read The Dead Cattail Assassins by P. Djeli Clark, which I believe comes out on August 6th from Tor.com. Listen, I genuinely don't know if this is considered a short novel or a long novella. It's really flirting with that line there, so I'm just gonna leave it for the publisher to say what it is. But this is a high fantasy story about an undead assassin named Aveen the Eviscerator. She belongs to this prestigious guild of assassins where they live and die and then live again by 3 essential rules that dictate every single one of their contracts. First, every contract they take on must be just. They can't kill anyone who's not an official mark, and once they accept a job, they have to carry it out. If they fail to kill their mark, they will permanently be killed themselves. So Aveen accepts a contract in the midst of this bustling citywide festival, and even though it should be a pretty straightforward job, when she goes to strike the killing blow, she realizes there's something off about her mark. Content warnings for descriptions of death, graphic violence, and graphic injury, as well as references to child abduction and child death. I had such a great time with this. I also talked about this one in my vlog, and as I said there, I'm pretty sure it was my first ever Peter Jelly Clark, which is wild because so many of his books are on my TBR, and I can say with absolute certainty that this will not be the last. As I said before, this is a very short book, so I'm incredibly impressed with the amount of quality world building that Peter Jelly Clark is able to build into the infrastructure of this story. The opening chapter is incredibly successful in establishing characters, stakes, and an unprecedented amount of tension. Like, the first chapter ends in a plot twist. Before I forget, the story is also incredibly voicey, which I wasn't expecting, I don't know why, but Aveen has such a strong and distinctive devil-may-care personality. She doesn't take anything seriously, she's unbothered by pretty much everyone around her, and the strength and character to her voice really carries the story in such a compelling way. And on top of that, the story is just a delightful mishmash of so many different genres. It's high fantasy, it's arguably fantasy thriller because of the assassin elements, there's a mystery, there's wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff, there's political drama. The story has everything you could possibly want. So on a surface level, it's fun, it's action-packed, there's a really intriguing mystery driving the story, there's gods and assassins and all these big picture things. Plot-wise, it's incredibly strong, and thematically it's also doing really exciting things. There were two main themes that stood out to me. The first is that stories will always matter, and stories will always have the power to change everything. This is especially present with the two main characters, Aveen and Sky, who start off as strangers, but gradually begin to trust each other more and more as they continuously exchange personal histories and stories. Aveen is also really into this serial murder mystery series, which comes up a few times in the story, sometimes as comedic relief and sometimes as a way to deepen her character, and the torch she carries for that series almost opens up an unexpected path for her to take. I won't say much more about that, but the other predominant theme in the story is regarding the tension between rules and obedience. Rules are obviously a big part of this story and a big part of Aveen's life. There are those three central tenets that govern the assassins in her guild, and those rules are non-negotiable. They must be followed, or there will be a significant cost. Obviously, as Aveen's realizing there's something wrong with this contract she's been issued, she's not able to adhere to those rules without question like she usually does. Something has gone horribly wrong, and therefore the rules as they stand are no longer applicable to her circumstances. So it really makes you think about the rules, the laws, the unspoken social contracts that we all enter into as humans and as a means to preserve and progress our ways of life. But it's also true that not all of those rules and contracts are made in good faith. So how do we decide when to adhere to those rules and when to break them? Some rules are meant to be broken or rewritten and reimagined entirely, and we have to be prepared to do the breaking if going against the grain means doing the right thing. I really love what the story is doing with that idea. As I said before, it's epic, it's exciting. The world that Peter Jelly Clark is able to build and the characterization he's able to execute in these 9 chapters kind of blows my mind. I had such a great time with this, definitely a new favorite. I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I listened to the audiobook of All the Fighting Parts by Hannah V. Sawyer, which is read by the author herself. Hannah V. Sawyer is a poet, and this is her debut YA novel written in verse. It's pitched as Grown meets the Poet X, and while I don't always put a lot of stock in comp titles, those two actually make a lot of sense. It's about a 16-year-old girl named Amina who's always been very opinionated, strong-willed, and outspoken. After she loses her temper with a classmate, her dad thinks it would be a good idea for her to volunteer at their church. Unfortunately, she learns that the pastor is not the upstanding citizen that everyone believes him to be. She is sexually assaulted by him, which takes a huge toll on her mental health, and now everyone around her is struggling to understand why she's become so quiet and distant. So the story is really about her struggle to decide whether she should keep to herself or fight back and potentially put herself in the public spotlight. Content warnings for consensual sexual content, experienced sexism and sexual harassment, non-graphic references to sexual assault which takes place off-page, and sexual abuse, explorations of related trauma responses, and some discussions of parental death and grief. This was another huge surprise. It's, again, a book I haven't seen going around in my circles. It's a verse novel by a debut author, so going into this, there was really no telling what to expect, but I was really impressed. Yes, the story does tackle difficult topics and traumas. The synopsis makes no secret of that, but I was really impressed with how the author was able to approach those discussions with such a light hand. She absolutely gives them the weight that they deserve, but she also does a great job with making the story a safe space for survivors if they choose to engage with it. Honestly, initially I almost wrote this off because I was like, I don't know if I can handle something that dark, but it truly is a story that centers healing, community, empowerment, and self-love, and there's so much nuance surrounding what it means to fight. There's this prevalent misconception, especially when it comes to victims of sexual abuse, that the only way to fight, the only way to truly reclaim your power and your narrative is to speak out and to loudly fight back. There's still so much stigma surrounding these issues, especially the rights that victims have to their autonomy, bodily or otherwise. If someone doesn't speak out, that silence is still wrongfully construed as inauthenticity or weakness. I love that this story takes a far more complex and nuanced look at survivors' agency, how fighting can look like speaking out, standing up, pursuing legal justice, but fighting also means fighting for yourself, fighting to survive, fighting to heal, fighting to move towards a future of your own making. And even if those things are quieter or more internal than the alternative, that doesn't make them any less important. So the story extends a lot of grace to abuse victims, all the different paths they can take, and all the forms of healing they can choose to engage with, without positing any of those decisions as being inherently greater or lesser than the others. There's also a really emotionally satisfying parallel between this harrowing ongoing trial that Amina is facing and the gentleness and acceptance of her friends and her boyfriend who are really supporting her through all of it. So overall, this story was really incredible. It's beautifully and powerfully written. It makes space for a surprising amount of nuance given the condensed form and style of the story, and it works beautifully as a novel in verse. I would definitely read more from this author, and I gave this 4.5 stars. After that, I finally made some time to read On Air with Zoe Washington by Janae Marks. Janae Marks is one of my favorite middle grade authors. All of her books have been absolutely incredible, including From the Desk of Zoe Washington, which is the first book in this little series. To sum it up quickly, the first book is about Zoe writing letters back and forth with her biological father, who's been in jail her entire life and who she's never met. But when she realizes that he might be wrongfully imprisoned for a crime he didn't actually commit, she starts researching and investigating ways to bring him justice. In this second book, Zoe is continuing to explore and deepen that relationship with Marcus, her biological father. One of his biggest dreams besides earning his freedom was always to open his own restaurant, and because Zoe loves to bake herself, she gets it in her mind that they should do whatever it takes to make this dream happen, and happen fast. At the same time, because she's connecting more with Marcus, she also decides to start a podcast where she interviews exonerees and formerly imprisoned folks to learn more about their experiences. No content warnings really come to mind for this one. There might be a brief scene involving vomit. I didn't write it down, so I'm not entirely confident about that, but besides that, I can't really flag anything else. Janae Marks is truly extraordinary. I think her work is criminally underrated because it's doing such exciting things in the middle grade space. If you like Kelly Yang, especially her Front Desk series and her other middle grade series, you will absolutely love Janae Marks. I feel like they're kindred spirits in the middle grade space, and the work they do is so incredibly important for the upcoming generations of readers. On Air with Zoe Washington, much like all of Janae's other books, is such a beautiful exercise in empathy, growing compassion, the willingness to learn and also be wrong in the learning process, and most importantly, the vital project of community care in all of its forms. reforms. Before I get into that, I just have to say that I love Zoe as a character so much. She's determined, she's tenacious, she's ambitious, she dreams fearlessly and loudly and often, and she will do whatever it takes to reach those dreams. Not for herself, but because those dreams are often on behalf of the people she loves most. I deeply respect the project of this story because the relationship Zoe has with her incarcerated biological father presents a unique opportunity to have these essential conversations with and for young audiences. Conversations about not only systemic racism, but also criminal justice reform, the broken nature of the carceral system, the disproportionate rate of BIPOC imprisonment, and how our advocacy in supporting prison reform and former prisoners cannot afford to be as binary as guilty or not. There's so much more happening in that space, and the fact that this story is able to touch on all of those things and show Zoe grappling with them in a way that's informative, compassionate, and incredibly age-appropriate is just amazing. But what really blew me away about this story is not only the execution of those discussions, but also the thematic work the story is undertaking. Again, it's so incredibly centered on community care and creating ways for local communities to connect and support each other. It's so hopeful and it just fills my heart up so much. And Zoe's also learning that if you want to see the world change, you have to be willing to embody that change yourself. Especially as she's learning more about the realities of exonerees and the challenges that formerly imprisoned folks face when trying to reintegrate themselves into society, there's a part of her that recognizes that so much of this is unfair and more people should care and be doing something about it. But she's also gradually realizing that it's one thing to recognize that something should change, and it's another thing to actually take steps towards that change. Again, much like the Front Desk series, the Zoe Washington books show young readers the reality that yes, we as individuals cannot change every horrible thing about the world, but the reach that we have as individuals is also not insignificant. Caring for and connecting to your community makes a difference. I cannot recommend the Zoe Washington books and all of Janae Marks' books highly enough. I loved everything about this from start to finish, and I gave it 5 stars. Lastly, I got a chance to listen to an advanced copy of All We Were Promised by Ashton Lattimore, which comes out on April 2nd from Ballantine Books. The audiobook is read by Shayna Small, and the audiobook was shared with me courtesy of PRH Audio. This is historical fiction set in pre-Civil War Philadelphia. We're following 3 characters whose lives become intertwined. Charlotte and her father are runaway slaves who escaped their plantation many years ago, and they've been able to make a name for themselves in society because her dad is more white-passing, and he purposefully leans into that. But unfortunately, because he's keeping up this facade of whiteness, Charlotte has to then pose as his housemaid. In her limited free time, she struck up a friendship with Nell, a young black socialite and abolitionist, and she's hoping that by associating with Nell and being brought into her circles, she might actually be able to envision a real future for herself. But one day at the marketplace, she sees the familiar face of a girl named Evie, someone who was also a slave alongside her at the same plantation, and one of the many people that Charlotte had to leave behind without warning when she ran. Well, Evie, of course, wants to escape to freedom herself, and she appeals to Charlotte and Nell to help her do it. Content warnings for experienced racism, racist violence, and racist rhetoric, instances of anti-black violence, including physical assault and abduction, as well as references to chattel slavery, including beatings, human trafficking, and sexual abuse. I had no idea this book existed before 2024 began. It really caught my attention because the story is touching on some lesser discussed parts of American history in regards to the integration of free black communities into society and also abolitionist movements. I only speak for myself when I say this next part, but in school growing up, I was taught about the concept of abolition and abolitionist movements through a very white lens, which is not surprising now that I know that people in power dictate the narratives of history. But it was taught to me through a very white savior sort of perspective. All the textbooks basically painted this picture of how abolitionists were brave white people with consciences who leveraged their social status to help black people in need, basically positioning abolition as allyship, if that makes sense. That's why I so respect the project of this debut, because a majority of the abolitionists in this story, much like in history, are black. It's about free black people helping to free other black people, which is a huge part of abolitionist history and an incredibly different dynamic. And because the story is set in such a distinct time period, it's able to capture this almost forgotten period of time between the rise of chattel slavery and the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, the much later advent of segregation and Jim Crow laws. It's this space right as the bubble is going to burst where it's equally plausible for black folks to either be free or enslaved, wholly depending on where they are and their circumstances. And here's why I think the story works so well, because it beautifully brings in all those differing levels of freedom with the main characters, one of whom is currently enslaved, one of whom is a free runaway slave whose family is more middle class, and one of whom is an extremely wealthy socialite. So that really complicates everything because they're all coming at the concept of abolition from such different places. Their experiences overlap in some ways, but there's also places where those Venn diagram circles do not touch. And what the story is forcing the reader to grapple with is the fact that ultimately none of these characters are free, no matter their circumstances. As long as racism and anti-blackness prevails and is allowed to be perpetuated, especially systemically, then any freedom these characters obtain will always be relative. It will always be temporary. It will always be something that can be stripped from any one of them for any reason at any point. I love how the story is allowing the characters to confront the gaps in their respective experiences, to reframe their concept of freedom, especially if their freedom is so fragile that it can't extend beyond themselves. If their freedom is that limited, that constrained, that tenuous, then what is it really worth? In that way, the story is ultimately reaffirming that the purpose of freedom is to fight for those who don't yet have it. If we can't do that much without fearing retaliation, then are we truly free to begin with? Overall, this was great. The audiobook was incredibly well performed as well, which is no surprise because Shayna Small narrated The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez and gave a phenomenal performance there as well. Her southern accents and the way she's able to create such distinctive voices for this big cast of characters really made the audiobook engaging to listen to. There's also a bit of a fake engagement, childhood friends to lovers storyline with one of the characters as well, which I quite enjoyed. I do think the story spells things out a little more than I think is strictly necessary towards the end, but all in all, I would definitely recommend, and I gave this 4 stars. So those are all the books I read in February. If you've read any of them, I'd love to chat about them with you down below in the comments, or feel free to let me know about your most recent reads. That is everything I had to share for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.